The laughter echoed through the smoky saloon as Marcus Whitfield pointed his finger at the woman in the corner booth. She sat alone, her weathered hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey, her broad frame filling the wooden seat. The entire room joined in his cruel mockery, but none of them knew what would happen 3 days later when the Barlow gang came riding into Copper Ridge with guns blazing. When the dust settled and the smoke cleared, only 2 people remained standing in that god-forsaken town, Marcus Whitfield and the woman he had ridiculed. Her name was Eleanor Cassidy, and she would save his life in ways he never imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Whitfield had always considered himself the king of Copper Ridge. At 28, he owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, employed half the town's men, and commanded respect wherever his polished boots touched the dusty ground. His sandy hair was always perfectly combed, his mustache precisely trimmed, and his clothes pressed to perfection. Women swooned when he walked by, and men stepped aside to let him pass. The Golden Nugget Saloon served as his unofficial throne room every Friday evening. Marcus would stride through those swinging doors like he owned the place, which he practically did, having loaned the proprietor, Sam Henderson, the money to keep it running during the harsh winter of 1887. The familiar smell of tobacco, whiskey and sawdust would greet him as he made his way to his usual table near the bar, where admirers would gather to hear his latest business ventures or romantic conquests. This particular Friday, in early September, started no differently than any other. Marcus had just closed a deal to sell 500 head of cattle to the railroad company, earning him enough money to buy another 1,000 acres of prime grazing land. His mood was celebratory, his wallet heavy, and his ego inflated to dangerous proportions. The saloon buzzed with its usual evening crowd. Cowboys fresh off the range sat hunched over their drinks, sharing tales of ornery steers and rattlesnake encounters. Card players concentrated intensely on their poker hands, occasionally cursing when luck turned against them. Bar girls moved between tables, their colorful dresses swishing as they served drinks and collected coins. It was then that Eleanor Cassidy walked through the doors. Eleanor was not a woman who commanded attention through conventional beauty. At 45, she stood nearly 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and strong arms that spoke of years of hard physical labor. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her dress, while clean and mended, had clearly seen better days. She carried herself with quiet dignity, but her size made her an easy target for small-minded cruelty. She had come to town that day to collect payment for the vegetables she sold to the local grocery store. Eleanor lived alone on a small farm 5 miles outside Copper Ridge, where she grew the finest tomatoes, corn, and beans in the county. Her husband had died in a mining accident 7 years earlier, leaving her to work the land by herself. She rarely came to town, and when she did, she kept to herself. The Golden Nugget was not Eleanor's usual destination, but the September heat had been particularly brutal, and she craved something cold to drink before beginning her long ride home. She chose a corner booth away from the main crowd, hoping to enjoy her whiskey in peace. Marcus noticed her immediately. Perhaps it was the way conversation seemed to quiet when she entered, or maybe it was simply that Eleanor's presence disrupted the familiar rhythm of his domain. Whatever the reason, her arrival irritated him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Well, Marcus announced loudly, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the saloon. Looks like we've got ourselves a mountain visiting tonight, boys. The comment drew snickers from his usual crowd of sycophants. Tom Bradley, who worked as Marcus's foreman, let out a particularly loud guffaw. "Careful, Marcus," he called out. "Don't want her sitting on you by accident." Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on her glass, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. She had endured this type of treatment before, though rarely so publicly. In most situations, she simply ignored the comments and went about her business. But something about Marcus's tone carried a particular venom that cut deeper than usual. "I wonder how many horses it takes to carry her home," Marcus continued, emboldened by the laughter of his audience. He stood up from his chair, whiskey making him bolder and crueler than usual. Maybe we should take up a collection to buy her a wagon train. The laughter grew louder and more pointed. Even patrons who didn't particularly like Marcus found themselves chuckling along, caught up in the mob mentality that transforms ordinary people into participants in cruelty. The card players looked up from their games, grinning at the spectacle. The bar girls giggled behind their hands, though some looked uncomfortable with the direction the evening was taking. Eleanor slowly lifted her eyes from her drink and looked directly at Marcus. Her gaze was steady and unflinching, carrying a weight that made several men in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. She didn't speak, didn't defend herself, didn't rise to the bait. She simply looked at him with an expression that seemed to see right through his expensive clothes and polished exterior to something much smaller underneath. "What's the matter, Mountain?" Marcus pressed, interpreting her silence as weakness rather than strength. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too busy thinking about your next meal." This drew the biggest laugh yet. Tom Bradley slapped his knee and nearly fell off his chair. Even Sam Henderson, who generally tried to maintain order in his establishment, couldn't suppress a smile as he continued polishing glasses behind the bar. Eleanor finished her whiskey in one slow, deliberate swallow. She placed a coin on the table, stood up with careful dignity, and walked toward the door. Her footsteps were steady and measured, neither hurried nor defiant. She moved like a woman who had made peace with the world's cruelty long ago. As she reached the swinging doors, Marcus couldn't resist one final jab. "Don't forget to duck under the doorframe, Mountain. Wouldn't want you bringing the whole place down." The eruption of laughter that followed was loud enough to be heard 3 blocks away. Marcus basked in the attention, raising his glass in a mock toast as Eleanor disappeared into the night. He felt clever and powerful, the undisputed king of his domain, who had just reminded everyone of their proper place in the social hierarchy. What Marcus didn't know was that Eleanor Cassidy had spent 15 years married to Jack Cassidy, one of the finest horse trainers and sharpshooters in the territory. During those years, Jack had taught his wife everything he knew about riding, shooting, and surviving in a land that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. Eleanor could put 6 bullets through a silver dollar at 50 yards, track a wounded deer through rock country, and ride a horse through terrain that would challenge experienced cavalrymen. She had learned these skills not as parlor tricks or social accomplishments, but as necessary tools for survival on the frontier. When Jack died in that mind collapse, Eleanor had continued practicing everything he taught her, partly to honor his memory, and partly because she understood that a woman, alone in the wilderness, needed every advantage she could. Yet, the other thing Marcus didn't know was that 3 men had been watching the Golden Nugget from across the street that evening. They sat their horses in the shadows between buildings, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats. These men wore no badges, carried no legal authority, and answered to no law except their own twisted sense of justice. The Barlow gang had been operating in the territory for 6 months, robbing banks, rustling cattle, and terrorizing small towns throughout the region. Their leader, Dutch Barlow, was a former Confederate soldier who had never accepted the war's end. His 2 companions, Pike Morrison and Crazy Eddie Fontaine, were wanted men who had thrown in their lot with Barlow after escaping from a prison wagon near El Paso. They had been planning to hit Copper Ridge for weeks, studying the town's layout, learning the habits of its residents, and identifying potential threats. They knew about Sheriff Watson's drinking problem, understood that the bank kept most of its money in a safe that hadn't been updated since 1875, and had observed that the town's prominent citizens were soft men who had never faced real danger. What they hadn't expected to find was entertainment. Dutch Barlow watched Eleanor emerge from the saloon and mount her horse with fluid grace. Even in the dim light, he could see the way she handled herself, the confident way she gathered her reins, the natural seat she maintained in the saddle. the alert manner in which she scanned her surroundings before riding away. "That's a woman who knows her way around trouble," Dutch murmured to his companions. Pike Morrison spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Shame she's got to be in town when we make our play." "Maybe she won't be," Dutch replied thoughtfully. "Woman like that living alone probably doesn't come to town too regular." Inside the Golden Nugget, Marcus continued holding court, regaling his audience with increasingly elaborate descriptions of Eleanor's supposed shortcomings. He had no idea that his cruel entertainment had been observed by men who would soon turn his comfortable world upside down. The weekend passed peacefully enough. Marcus spent Saturday inspecting his cattle and Sunday attending church, where Reverend Matthews delivered a sermon about loving thy neighbor that went largely unheeded by the congregation. Eleanor tended her garden and repaired a section of fence that had been damaged during the previous week's storm. Neither of them gave much thought to their brief encounter in the saloon, though for vastly different reasons. Marcus had already moved on to other amusements and other targets for his wit. Eleanor had long ago learned not to waste energy on the opinions of small people living small lives. Monday morning dawned clear and hot, with the kind of crystalline sky that promised another scorching day. Marcus rose early and rode out to check on his northern pastures, where reports of sick cattle had reached him the previous evening. What he found there would change everything. 23 of his prize Herefords lay dead in a narrow canyon, their bodies bloated and beginning to smell in the heat. At first, Marcus assumed they had been poisoned by bad water or toxic plants. But closer examination revealed bullet holes in several of the carcasses. The Barlow gang had struck their first blow. Marcus rode hard back to town, his mind racing with implications. Those cattle represented nearly $5,000 in lost revenue, money he had already committed to purchasing additional land. More troubling was the realization that someone had targeted him specifically, picking his most valuable stock for destruction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He burst through the doors of Sheriff Watson's office to find the lawman already 3 drinks into his morning routine. Watson was a good man who had served the town faithfully for 12 years. But age and whiskey had dulled his reflexes and clouded his judgment. "Sheriff, I need you to ride out to Canyon Creek immediately," Marcus demanded. "Someone's been killing my cattle." Watson looked up from his bottle with bleary eyes. "Cattle die, Marcus. It's the nature of the business. These didn't die naturally, Sheriff. They were shot, murdered. This is rustling, and I want the men responsible caught and hanged." The urgency in Marcus's voice finally penetrated Watson's alcohol-fogged brain. He managed to focus enough to understand that this was serious business, the kind of trouble that could cost him his job if he didn't handle it properly. All right, Watson mumbled, struggling to his feet. "Let me get my horse, and we'll ride out there." "But Marcus, you need to understand that tracking men in this country ain't easy work. Could be they're long gone by now." Marcus wanted to argue, to demand immediate action and swift justice, but he recognized that Sheriff Watson was his only legal recourse. He bit back his frustration and waited while the older man gathered his gun belt and hat. The ride to Canyon Creek took 40 minutes, during which Watson sobered up enough to conduct a proper investigation. What he found at the scene made his weathered face go pale. The cattle had indeed been shot, but not randomly or carelessly. Someone had taken time to select the finest animals in the herd, executing them with precision shots that spoke of considerable skill with firearms. More disturbing were the tracks they left behind, 3 horses all shod, moving in formation like military cavalry. "This ain't the work of drifters or desperate men, Marcus," Watson said quietly. "These boys knew what they were doing. They came here for a reason." "What reason?" "I've never wronged anyone in this territory. My business dealings are honest and fair." Watson studied the hoofprints more carefully, his experienced eye reading the story they told. "Maybe it ain't about what you done, but what you represent. Some men got grievances against the whole world, and they take it out on folks who seem to have more than their share of good fortune. The implications of Watson's words settled over Marcus like a cold fog. If this attack had been personal, if someone harbored specific hatred toward him, then his family, his employees, and his property all remained in danger. What do we do now, Sheriff? Watson mounted his horse with the slow movements of a man feeling every one of his 57 years. We ride back to town and send telegrams to every sheriff and marshal within 100 miles. Description of the tracks, details of the crime, request for assistance. Then we wait and hope they move on to easier targets. Wait? Marcus's voice rose in disbelief. They just cost me $5,000 and you want to wait? Son, I understand you're angry, and you got every right to be. But chasing professional killers across open country with just the two of us would be pure suicide. These men are dangerous, and they're prepared for trouble. We need help. Marcus wanted to argue, to demand action that matched his outrage, but deep down he knew Watson was right. He had lived his entire life in a civilized bubble where problems were solved with money and influence. This was different territory entirely, and he was completely unprepared for it. They rode back to town in grim silence, each man lost in his own thoughts about what the attack might mean for Copper Ridge's future. Neither of them noticed the three riders watching from a distant ridge, or the way those riders seemed to be studying every detail of the town's layout. The Barlow gang was just getting started. Tuesday morning brought news that chilled every resident of Copper Ridge to the bone. The telegraph operator, Henry Mullins, burst into the sheriff's office with a message that would shatter the town's peaceful existence forever. "Sheriff Watson, you need to see this immediately," Henry gasped, his usually steady hands trembling as he held out the yellow paper. His face had gone ashen, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the early morning coolness. Watson snatched the telegram and read it twice before the full meaning sank in. The message came from Marshal Garrett in Silver Falls, a town 60 miles northeast of Copper Ridge. 3 days earlier, the Barlow gang had hit the Silver Falls bank, making off with $8,000 after killing 2 tellers and a customer who tried to intervene. More disturbing was the description of their methods. Dutch Barlow and his men didn't simply rob and run like typical outlaws. They seemed to take pleasure in terrorizing their victims, forcing bank employees to crawl on the ground while begging for their lives, making customers empty their own pockets at gunpoint, and leaving behind messages scrawled in blood on the walls. The message at Silver Falls had read, "This is what happens to towns that think they're safe." Watson's blood turned to ice water as he connected this information to the cattle killing at Marcus's ranch. The Barlow gang wasn't just passing through Copper Ridge, they were studying it, preparing for something much worse than a few dead steers. "Henry, I need you to send telegrams to every lawman within 200 miles, Watson ordered. "Tell them we have confirmed Barlow gang activity in our area and request immediate assistance. Then find Mayor Henderson and tell him to call an emergency town meeting for this evening." Henry nodded frantically and rushed back to his telegraph office, understanding that the next few hours might determine whether Copper Ridge survived or joined the growing list of ghost towns scattered across the territory. Watson strapped on his gun belt with hands that hadn't shaken in 20 years of law enforcement. He had faced rustlers, claimed jumpers, and dangerous drifters throughout his career, but the Barlow gang represented something entirely different. These men weren't desperate criminals driven by hunger or circumstance. They were organized killers who seemed to enjoy spreading terror for its own sake. His first stop was Marcus Whitfield's ranch. If Barlow had specifically targeted Marcus's cattle, there had to be a reason. Perhaps Marcus had unknowingly crossed paths with one of them in the past. Or maybe they saw his wealth and influence as symbols of everything they wanted to destroy. The ride to the Whitfield spread took Watson through some of the most beautiful country in the territory. Rolling hills covered in tall grass stretched toward distant mountains, while cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sunshine. It was hard to believe that such serene landscape could harbor the kind of evil that had visited Silver Falls. Marcus emerged from his ranch house before Watson had fully dismounted. His face creased with worry, lines that hadn't been there a week earlier. The confident swagger that usually characterized his movements had been replaced by nervous energy that kept his hands in constant motion. "Sheriff, please tell me you have good news about those men who killed my cattle." Watson removed his hat and wiped sweat from his balding head. "I'm afraid the news is worse than we thought, Marcus. Much worse." He explained about the Silver Falls robbery, the gang's methods, and his growing suspicion that Copper Ridge had been marked as their next target. Marcus listened with increasing alarm, his face growing paler with each detail. "But why would they target me, specifically?" Marcus asked. "I've never had any dealings with outlaws or criminals. My business is completely legitimate." "That might be exactly the problem," Watson replied grimly. "Men like Barlow don't need personal reasons to hate. Sometimes success and respectability are enough to make you a target. You represent everything they've convinced themselves they're fighting against." Marcus felt his comfortable world crumbling around him. For the first time in his adult life, money and influence couldn't protect him from the threats he faced. "What do we do, Sheriff? How do we stop them?" Watson looked around the ranch, taking in the well-maintained buildings, the expensive horses in the corrals, and the obvious prosperity that Marcus had built through years of hard work. All of it could be destroyed in a single night if the Barlow gang decided to make an example of the Whitfield spread. "We need to get you and your men into town, where we can provide some protection. Send riders to all your line camps and bring everyone back to the main headquarters. I want armed guards posted around your property, and I want them to shoot first and ask questions later if they see anyone suspicious." Marcus nodded, grateful to have concrete actions he could take. "I'll send Tom Bradley and the other foreman out immediately." "How many men do you think we'll need?" "More than we have," Watson admitted. "I've sent for help from every law enforcement agency in the territory, but it'll take days for anyone to reach us. Until then, we're on our own." As if summoned by their conversation, Tom Bradley appeared from the direction of the horse corrals, leading a saddled mount. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of a man who had spent 40 years working under the open sky, and his confident bearing spoke of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. "Boss, I heard you talking with the sheriff," Tom said. "Want me to start gathering the boys?" Marcus quickly explained the situation, watching Tom's expression grow increasingly serious as the full scope of the threat became clear. Unlike his employer, Tom Bradley had experience with violent men. He had served as a cavalry sergeant during the Indian Wars and understood exactly what professional killers could accomplish when they set their minds to destruction. "How long do we have?" Tom asked Watson. "No way to know for sure. Could be tonight, could be next week. But based on their pattern, they like to hit towns on weekends when the banks have more cash and the streets are full of people to terrorize." Tom mentally calculated the timeline. Today was Tuesday, which gave them at least 3 days to prepare defenses and hopefully receive reinforcements from neighboring towns. It wasn't much time, but it was something. "I can have 20 good men armed and ready by tomorrow morning," Tom told them. "The problem is, we don't know where they'll hit first. Could be the bank, could be Marcus's place, could be anywhere in town." Watson had been thinking about the same problem. Copper Ridge was too large and sprawling to defend every possible target with the limited manpower at their disposal. They would have to make difficult choices about what to protect and what to sacrifice. "We'll set up a central defense point at the courthouse," Watson decided. "It's stone construction, good sightlines in all directions, and large enough to shelter civilians if necessary. Tom, I want your men positioned around the building with clear fields of fire. If Barlow wants to take this town, he'll have to come through us first." Marcus listened to this planning with growing unease. The casual way both men discussed potential casualties and property destruction made the threat feel suddenly real in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't some distant problem that money could solve. It was immediate danger that required violence to resolve. "What about the townspeople?" Marcus asked. Shouldn't we evacuate women and children? Watson shook his head grimly. Where would they go? Nearest safe town is 3 days' ride, and we can't spare the men to escort them. Besides, running might just make things worse. Barlow gang likes to chase fleeing people, seems to add to their enjoyment. The 3 men spent the next hour discussing defensive positions, ammunition supplies, and communication plans. By the time Watson prepared to return to town, they had established a rough strategy that might give Copper Ridge a fighting chance. As Watson rode back toward town, he made several stops at outlying farms and ranches, spreading word of the threat and asking for volunteers to help defend the community. The response was mixed. Some men immediately volunteered their guns and their lives, while others began making quiet preparations to disappear into the countryside until the danger passed. One farm he didn't visit was Eleanor Cassidy's place, 5 miles east of town. Watson had always respected Eleanor's independence and assumed she could take care of herself, but the approaching crisis made him reconsider that decision. A woman alone, no matter how capable, would be helpless against organized killers. Eleanor, however, was far from helpless or unaware. She had heard the news about Silver Falls from her nearest neighbor, Walt Morrison, who had stopped by that morning to warn her about potential trouble. Walt had urged her to pack a few belongings and stay in town until the crisis passed, but Eleanor had politely declined his offer. What Walt didn't understand was that Eleanor felt safer on her own land than she would anywhere else. Her farm was positioned in a natural fortress, a small valley surrounded by rocky hills that provided excellent defensive positions and multiple escape routes. More importantly, she knew every inch of the surrounding terrain better than anyone else in the county. After Walt left, Eleanor spent the afternoon checking her weapons and ammunition. She owned a Winchester rifle that had belonged to her late husband, a shotgun for close-quarters defense, and a Colt revolver that she wore in a holster whenever she worked outside. All 3 weapons were meticulously maintained and loaded with fresh cartridges. She also took inventory of her other supplies, enough food and water to last 2 weeks, medical supplies for treating wounds, and a hidden cache of gold coins that could fund a new start somewhere else if necessary. Eleanor had learned long ago that survival depended on preparation and the willingness to use whatever force the situation demanded. As evening approached, she climbed to the highest point on her property and studied the surrounding landscape through a pair of field glasses that had also belonged to Jack. The glasses revealed nothing unusual, but Eleanor's instincts told her that trouble was closer than anyone realized. Back in Copper Ridge, the emergency town meeting was drawing to a close in the courthouse. Nearly 200 residents had crowded into the building to hear Sheriff Watson explain the threat they faced. The mood was a mixture of fear, anger, and determination that reflected the complex nature of frontier communities. Some citizens demanded immediate action, insisting that a posse should ride out to hunt down the Barlow gang before they could attack the town. Others argued for evacuation, pointing out that no amount of money was worth risking innocent lives. A few suggested negotiation, proposing that the town could pay Barlow to move on to easier targets. Watson listened patiently to all the suggestions before explaining why none of them would work. A posse of inexperienced townsmen would be slaughtered by professional killers. Evacuation was impossible given the distances involved and the likelihood that Barlow would interpret flight as weakness. Negotiation with murderers was simply another form of suicide. The plain truth is that we're going to have to fight, Watson concluded. These men aren't reasonable people looking for easy money. They're killers who enjoy what they do, and the only way to stop them is to make them dead. The blunt assessment silenced the room for several long moments. Finally, Mayor Henderson stood up from his seat in the front row. Henderson was a small, thin man who had built the town's largest general store through careful planning and conservative business practices. He had never fired a gun in anger, but he understood that leadership sometimes required difficult decisions. Sheriff Watson, you have the town's complete support in whatever measures you deem necessary, Henderson announced. We'll organize volunteer patrols, set up supply stations, and prepare medical facilities for casualties. Copper Ridge has survived droughts, Indian raids, and economic panics. We'll survive this too. The meeting broke up with residents scattering to make their own preparations. Some headed home to clean weapons and count ammunition. Others went to secure their most valuable possessions or make arrangements for their family's safety. A few simply walked to the nearest saloon to drink away their fear of what the coming days might bring. Marcus Whitfield found himself standing alone outside the courthouse as the crowd dispersed. For the first time in his adult life, he felt truly powerless. All his wealth and influence meant nothing against men who measured success in blood rather than dollars. The comfortable certainties that had defined his existence were crumbling, leaving him face to face with his own mortality. He walked slowly toward the Golden Nugget Saloon, not because he wanted to drink, but because he needed familiar surroundings to help him process what was happening. The saloon was nearly empty. Most patrons had attended the town meeting and were now home preparing for potential siege conditions. As Marcus sat alone at his usual table, he found himself thinking about Friday night and his cruel treatment of Eleanor Cassidy. The memory brought him no pleasure now, only a vague sense of shame that he couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps it was the realization that he might soon face the same kind of helplessness that Eleanor had experienced. Or maybe it was simply the understanding that small cruelties seemed petty in the face of genuine evil. Outside in the darkness, 3 riders sat their horses on a hill overlooking the town. Dutch Barlow studied the layout of Copper Ridge through stolen army field glasses, noting the positions of guards, the location of the bank, and the defensive preparations that were already becoming visible. "Looks like they know we're coming," Pike Morrison observed. Dutch lowered the glasses with a cold smile. "Good, I was afraid this might be too easy. There's no sport in terrorizing sheep, but these folks might actually provide some entertainment." Crazy Eddie Fontaine giggled with anticipation. "When do we hit them, Dutch?" "Friday night," Dutch replied. "Give them a few more days to work themselves into a panic. Fear makes people stupid, and stupid people make mistakes we can exploit." The 3 outlaws turned their horses away from the town and melted back into the darkness, leaving Copper Ridge to endure 3 more days of mounting tension before the storm finally broke. In her farmhouse 5 miles away, Eleanor Cassidy checked the loads in her weapons one final time before settling into a chair by her front window. She would maintain watch through the night, as she had every night since hearing about the Silver Falls robbery. If trouble came to her door, she would be ready for it. Wednesday dawned with an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on Copper Ridge like a physical weight. The air hung motionless, thick with dust, and the smell of fear sweat from animals and humans alike. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing, as if nature itself sensed the approaching violence. Eleanor Cassidy rose before sunrise, as was her custom, but this morning brought tasks far different from her usual farm routine. Instead of tending her vegetable garden or feeding livestock, she spent the early hours camouflaging her defensive positions around the farmhouse. Using branches, rocks, and old canvas, she created concealed firing points that would allow her to cover every approach to her property. Her years of watching Jack practice military tactics had taught her valuable lessons about defensive strategy. The key was not to create an impregnable fortress, which was impossible with limited resources, but to force attackers to expose themselves while keeping defenders hidden and mobile. She positioned her Winchester at the upstairs bedroom window, where it commanded a clear view of the main road and the open ground surrounding the house. The shotgun went into a specially built cabinet on the first floor, easily accessible but hidden from casual observation. Her Colt revolver remained holstered at her hip, loaded and ready for immediate use. The most important preparation was the tunnel Jack had dug during their second year of marriage. What had started as a root cellar had been extended into an escape route that emerged 50 yards from the house behind a carefully maintained screen of brush and rocks. If attackers managed to surround the farmhouse, the tunnel would provide a way to disappear into the hills where Eleanor knew every trail and hiding place. While Eleanor prepared her solitary defense, Copper Ridge buzzed with activity that bordered on barely controlled panic. Tom Bradley had arrived in town before dawn with 19 armed cowboys, all experienced men who understood that their lives might depend on their shooting skills in the coming days. These weren't the soft townsmen that Dutch Barlow expected to encounter. They were hard-bitten frontier veterans who had fought Indians, rustlers, and claim jumpers. Most had served in either the Union or Confederate armies, and all of them knew how to handle weapons under combat conditions. Their presence in town shifted the odds considerably, though whether it would be enough remained to be seen. Sheriff Watson assigned defensive positions with the methodical care of a man who understood that small mistakes could lead to large disasters. The courthouse became the central strongpoint, its thick stone walls capable of stopping rifle bullets and its elevated position providing good observation of the surrounding area. 4 riflemen occupied the building's tower, where they could cover the main street and the approaches to the bank. Additional positions were established at key intersections throughout the town. 2-man teams took up posts behind reinforced barricades that could stop horses and provide cover during a firefight. Each team had enough ammunition for a sustained battle and clear lines of retreat toward the courthouse if their positions became untenable. The bank received special attention, since previous Barlow gang robberies had always targeted financial institutions. Watson stationed 6 men inside the building, armed with shotguns that would be devastatingly effective in the confined space. The bank's thick walls and small windows made it a natural fortress, assuming the defenders could hold their positions long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Marcus Whitfield found himself assigned to the courthouse defense, much to his discomfort. He'd never fired a weapon at another human being and wasn't certain he could do so when the moment arrived. Watson had placed him there partly because the position was relatively safe, but also because Marcus needed to be seen sharing the dangers faced by ordinary citizens. You don't have to be a hero, Marcus, Watson explained as they checked the courthouse's defensive positions. Just keep your head down and shoot at anything that doesn't belong here. These outlaws aren't Superman. They bleed just like everyone else. Marcus nodded without confidence, handling his borrowed rifle with the awkward grip of someone more comfortable with ledger books than firearms. Tom Bradley had spent an hour that morning teaching him basic marksmanship, but there was no substitute for experience under fire. The waiting was the hardest part. Wednesday passed with agonizing slowness as armed men maintained their positions while trying to appear calm for the benefit of civilians who couldn't hide their terror. Women kept children indoors. Shopkeepers nervously served customers who jumped at every unexpected sound. And even the town's dogs seemed to sense that something terrible was approaching. Thursday brought news that shattered any remaining hopes for outside assistance. A telegram from the territorial marshal explained that the Barlow gang had struck again, this time hitting a stagecoach 30 miles south of Copper Ridge. All 6 passengers and both guards had been killed, apparently for no other reason than the gang's amusement. More disturbing was the timing. The attack had occurred Tuesday afternoon, which meant Barlow was moving in a deliberate pattern that pointed directly toward Copper Ridge. "They're playing with us," Watson told Marcus and Tom Bradley during an emergency meeting in his office. "Could have hit us already if they wanted to. Instead, they're building fear and isolating us from help." Tom studied the rough map Watson had spread across his desk, marking the locations of recent Barlow gang activities. The pattern was clear. Each attack had moved closer to Copper Ridge while cutting off potential escape routes and sources of reinforcement. "Smart bastards," Tom admitted grudgingly. "They're not just killers, they're strategists. By the time they hit us, we'll be completely on our own with nowhere to run." Marcus stared at the map with growing horror. The red marks indicating gang activity formed a tightening noose around Copper Ridge, with each attack designed to maximize psychological impact on the final target. "How do we fight men who think this far ahead?" "Same way you fight any enemy," Watson replied grimly. "You hurt them worse than they hurt you. Doesn't matter how smart they are if they're dead." The conversation was interrupted by Henry Mullins bursting through the office door with another telegram clutched in his shaking hands. This message came from a different source, a surviving cavalry patrol that had encountered the Barlow gang near Mesa Verde. According to the military report, Dutch Barlow's group had grown to include 7 men, rather than the original 3. They had recruited additional members from among deserters, escaped prisoners, and other outlaws, attracted by their reputation for successful violence. More troubling was the description of their equipment. They rode quality horses, carried modern repeating rifles, and seemed to have unlimited ammunition. 7 men, Tom mused. Still manageable odds if we're smart about it. Watson wasn't so optimistic. 7 professionals with good equipment and military training. That's like facing a whole cavalry squad that doesn't follow any rules of civilized warfare. The news about reinforcements forced them to recalculate their defensive strategy. With more attackers to cover additional approaches, their carefully planned positions might not be adequate. They would need to concentrate their forces rather than trying to defend every potential target. "We pull everyone back to the courthouse area," Watson decided. "Abandon the outer positions and create a killing ground in the center of town. Let them come to us instead of trying to be everywhere at once." This decision meant sacrificing the bank, the saloons, and most of the business district to focus on protecting the civilian population. It was a bitter choice, but the only realistic option given their limited manpower. Thursday night passed without incident, but nobody slept well. Armed guards maintained their watches, while families huddled behind locked doors and barricaded windows. The normal sounds of evening, children playing, adults socializing, dogs barking at familiar sounds, had been replaced by an unnatural silence, broken only by the occasional challenge of nervous sentries. Marcus spent the night in the courthouse, lying on a bedroll in what had once been Judge Patterson's chambers. Sleep came in brief, uneasy intervals punctuated by dreams of gunfire and screaming. Each time he woke, the reality of his situation seemed more surreal than his nightmares. Eleanor, meanwhile, maintained her solitary vigil at her farmhouse. She had detected no signs of immediate threat, but her instincts warned that the calm was artificial. Experienced hunters knew how to approach their prey without alarming it until the moment of attack arrived. She had spent Thursday afternoon making final preparations that went beyond mere defensive positions. Eleanor had removed everything of sentimental value from the house, burying Jack's personal effects and their wedding photographs in waterproof containers at predetermined locations throughout her property. If the house burned, she would still retain the memories that mattered most. More practically, she had prepared several escape caches containing food, water, ammunition, and gold coins. These supplies were hidden at strategic points along the trails leading into the mountains, positioned to support a fighting retreat if her primary defenses failed. As Friday's dawn approached, Eleanor sat by her kitchen table, cleaning her weapons one final time. The familiar ritual of oiling, metal and checking mechanisms helped calm her nerves while ensuring that her firearms would function perfectly when needed. She thought about Jack and the lessons he had taught her about facing danger. "Fear is natural," he had always said, "but panic will get you killed. When trouble comes, you focus on what needs doing, and you do it without hesitation. Everything else is just noise." The advice seemed particularly relevant now. Eleanor could feel the approaching storm in every fiber of her being, but she remained focused on the practical steps that might keep her alive through the next 24 hours. Friday morning brought an unnatural quiet to Copper Ridge. Even the usual sounds of commerce and daily life seemed muted. as if the entire town was holding its breath in anticipation of violence. Store owners opened their businesses but kept rifles close at hand. Children were kept inside despite the beautiful weather. Even the stray dogs that usually roamed the streets had found places to hide. Sheriff Watson made his final rounds, checking defensive positions and trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. His 20 years of law enforcement had taught him to read the signs of approaching trouble, and everything about this Friday felt wrong. The telegraph office remained busy as Watson continued sending requests for assistance to every law enforcement agency in the territory. Most of the responses were discouraging. Other towns were dealing with their own problems. Territorial marshals were already committed to active pursuits, and the nearest army units were too far away to provide timely help. One telegram offered a glimmer of hope. Marshal Davidson from Canyon City was attempting to organize a combined posse from several neighboring communities, but the earliest they could reach Copper Ridge would be Sunday morning. Watson filed this information without much optimism. If Barlow planned to attack that weekend, Saturday night seemed the most likely timing. Marcus spent Friday morning at the courthouse, trying to make himself useful while fighting off waves of panic that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. He had never imagined that his comfortable life could be shattered so completely by forces beyond his control. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. For years, Marcus had prided himself on being master of his domain, a man whose wealth and influence could solve any problem. Now he found himself dependent on the courage of working men he had always considered his social inferiors, waiting for professional killers to decide when and how he might die. Tom Bradley noticed Marcus's deteriorating emotional state and took time from his own preparations to offer some practical advice. "The waiting is always the hardest part," the foreman explained. "Once the shooting starts, you'll be too busy to think about being scared." "How do you know I'll be able to fight when the time comes?" Marcus asked. "I've never shot at another human being." Tom studied his employer with the frank appraisal of someone who had led men in combat. "Don't know for sure," he admitted. "Some men freeze up, others find courage they never knew they had. Won't know which kind you are until the bullets start flying." The honest assessment didn't comfort Marcus, but it helped him understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. He spent the remaining hours of daylight practicing with his rifle, learning to load and fire with something approaching competence. As Friday evening approached, the tension in Copper Ridge became almost unbearable. Every shadow might hide an enemy. Every sound could signal the beginning of the attack. Men jumped at the slightest provocation, and several false alarms sent defenders scrambling to positions that turned out to be unnecessary. The sun set in a blaze of red and gold that seemed to mock the town's fear with its beauty. As darkness fell, Copper Ridge transformed from a thriving community into an armed camp waiting for war. In her farmhouse 5 miles away, Eleanor lit no lamps and made no unnecessary sounds. She had positioned herself in the upstairs bedroom where she could observe the approaches to her property while remaining invisible to outside observers. Her weapons were loaded and ready, her escape routes memorized, and her resolve hardened by the knowledge that survival depended entirely on her own skills and determination. The night was going to be long, and morning would bring either victory or death for everyone in Copper Ridge. There would be no middle ground, no compromise, no mercy from men who measured success in the screams of their victims. Dutch Barlow and his expanded gang were somewhere in the darkness, making final preparations for the assault that would either establish their reputation as the most feared outlaws in the territory or end their careers in a hail of defensive gunfire. The storm was about to break. The first shot came at 11:30, Friday night, shattering the oppressive silence like thunder in a clear sky. Jimmy Rawlins, a 19-year-old cowboy posted at the northern edge of town, never had a chance to cry out a warning. The bullet that killed him was fired from such close range that the muzzle flash burned his shirt. Dutch Barlow had positioned his men with the precision of a military commander conducting a siege operation. 3 riders approached from the north, while 2 others circled around to attack from the east. The remaining pair waited in the hills south of town, ready to cut off any attempt at escape or reinforcement. The strategy was designed to create maximum confusion while preventing organized resistance. By striking simultaneously from multiple directions, Barlow hoped to fragment the defenders and turn their carefully planned positions into isolated death traps. Sheriff Watson heard the gunshot and immediately rang the courthouse. Bell, 3 quick pulls that signaled the beginning of hostilities. The sound carried clearly through the still night air, alerting every defender to take his assigned position and prepare for battle. Marcus Whitfield jerked awake from an uneasy doze, his heart hammering as the reality of the situation crashed over him like an avalanche. This was no longer about planning and preparation. Men with guns were trying to kill him, and his survival depended on his ability to kill them first. Tom Bradley was already moving, checking his rifle and positioning himself at one of the courthouse's upper windows. His military experience had taught him that the first few minutes of any engagement were critical. Successful defense required immediate, accurate return fire that would disrupt the attacker's timing. "Stay low and shoot careful," Tom called to Marcus. "Don't waste ammunition on shadows, but don't hesitate when you have a clear target." The second wave of gunfire erupted from the eastern approach, where 2 of Barlow's men had taken position behind the abandoned blacksmith shop. Their repeating rifles sent a deadly stream of bullets toward the courthouse, forcing defenders to duck behind stone window frames while glass exploded around them. Watson crouched behind his desk, studying the muzzle flashes to determine enemy positions. The attack pattern confirmed his worst fears. They were facing coordinated professionals who understood tactical movement and concentrated fire. This wouldn't be the chaotic brawl that characterized most frontier gunfights. "They're trying to pin us down while the rest of them move into position," Watson shouted over the gunfire. "Don't let them get comfortable out there." The defenders opened fire, their shots carefully aimed at the spots where enemy muzzle flashes had revealed concealed positions. The courthouse's stone construction provided excellent protection, while its elevated position offered superior fields of fire. But the attackers had chosen their locations well. 3 blocks away, the bank of Copper Ridge became the focus of a separate assault. Pike Morrison and Crazy Eddie Fontaine had worked their way through the back alleys to reach the financial institution without being detected by the outer sentries. Their objective wasn't robbery. Dutch Barlow had made it clear that this operation was about terror rather than profit. The 6 defenders inside the bank never saw their attackers until explosive charges demolished the building's rear wall. Morrison and Fontaine had learned demolition techniques during their army service, knowledge they now applied to criminal purposes. The blast killed 2 defenders instantly and left the others stunned and vulnerable. Crazy Eddie lived up to his nickname by charging through the smoking breach with both pistols blazing, laughing maniacally as he gunned down wounded men who couldn't defend themselves. Morrison followed with more calculated violence, methodically finishing off anyone who showed signs of life. The explosion echoed across Copper Ridge like a cannon shot, telling every defender that their worst nightmares were becoming reality. This wasn't just a robbery or raid. The Barlow gang intended to destroy the entire town as an example to others who might consider resistance. Watson cursed as he realized that his careful defensive planning had been outmaneuvered by enemies who thought several steps ahead. The bank's fall meant that Barlow controlled the town's financial district and could use the building as a base for further attacks. "Tom, take 4 men and try to retake the bank," Watson ordered. "Marcus, you're with me. We need to get a message to the territorial marshal if any of us survive this." Marcus wanted to object that he wasn't qualified for dangerous missions, but the words died in his throat as he looked into Watson's eyes. The sheriff's expression made it clear that there was no safe place in Copper Ridge, that The survival required active participation in the fighting. The two men made their way carefully through the courthouse's lower level, avoiding windows where sniper fire might find them. Watson's plan was to reach the telegraph office and send final messages requesting immediate assistance, assuming Henry Mullins was still alive to operate his equipment. Outside, the battle intensified as both sides settled into the deadly rhythm of combat. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies, while bullets whined through the air or splintered wood with sharp cracks. The acrid smell of gunpowder began to mix with the copper scent of blood. Dutch Barlow moved through the chaos with the calm confidence of someone who had orchestrated dozens of similar attacks. His position behind the grain elevator provided excellent observation of the entire battlefield, while keeping him safely out of direct fire. From there, he could direct his men's movements and identify weaknesses in the defenders' positions. What he saw pleased him enormously. The townspeople were fighting bravely but predictably, following textbook defensive tactics that worked against conventional enemies. Unfortunately for them, the Barlow gang had never been conventional. "Jackson, Murphy, work your way around to the church and set it on fire," Dutch called to two of his newer recruits. "Let's see how long their courage lasts when the whole town starts burning." The church represented more than just another building to Copper Ridge's residents. It was the spiritual and social center of their community, the place where they celebrated marriages, mourned the dead, and gathered to face collective challenges. Destroying it would strike at the heart of everything that held the town together. 5 miles east of the battle, Eleanor Cassidy heard the distant gunfire and knew that her worst fears had come to pass. The sound carried clearly through the still night air, telling her that Copper Ridge was under full assault by enemies who intended to leave nothing but ashes and corpses. Her first instinct was to mount her horse and ride toward town, but years of frontier experience had taught her to think strategically rather than emotionally. A lone woman charging into a battle between 30 or 40 armed men would accomplish nothing except adding another body to the casualty count. Instead, Eleanor made careful preparations for the possibility that survivors from the town might flee in her direction. She filled every available container with water, prepared medical supplies for treating gunshot wounds, and positioned her best rifle where it could cover the main trail leading to her farm. If Dutch Barlow's men pursued fleeing townspeople, they would find Eleanor Cassidy waiting for them with 17 years of accumulated rage and a Winchester rifle that never missed its target. Back in Copper Ridge, the defenders' situation deteriorated rapidly as the church burst into flames. The fire spread quickly in the dry September air, illuminating the entire town center and destroying the darkness that had provided some protection for defensive movements. Marcus found himself crouched behind a water trough near the telegraph office, bullets snapping past his head with sounds like angry wasps. Terror had given way to a strange clarity that allowed him to function despite circumstances that should have paralyzed him with fear. Sheriff Watson lay 20 feet away, blood seeping from a shoulder wound that had shattered his left arm. The older man was still conscious, but weakening rapidly from blood loss. His service revolver lay beside him, empty of ammunition and beyond his ability to reload. "Marcus," Watson gasped, "get to Henry's office. Send word that we need help now, not tomorrow." The telegraph office was 50 yards away, across open ground that was swept by rifle fire from multiple positions. Making that journey would require either incredible luck or a level of courage that Marcus wasn't certain he possessed. He looked at Watson's pale face and made a decision that surprised him. The comfortable businessman who had spent his life avoiding physical risks was gone, replaced by someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. Marcus sprinted toward the telegraph office in a zigzag pattern that made him harder to hit, while bullets kicked up dust around his feet. A slug tore through his coat sleeve, and another burned across his scalp, but he reached Henry Mullins's door without taking a serious wound. The office was dark and apparently empty. Marcus called Henry's name while fumbling for matches to light the oil lamp on the desk. What he found when light filled the room made his stomach lurch with revulsion. Henry Mullins sat slumped over his telegraph key, 3 bullet holes in his back, telling the story of his death. The attackers had silenced Copper Ridge's communications before the main assault began, ensuring that no calls for help could be sent during the critical early stages of the battle. Marcus stared at Henry's corpse for several precious seconds before realizing that the telegraph equipment might still be functional. He had watched the operator work often enough to understand the basic principles, though he had never attempted to send messages himself. His fingers fumbled with the brass key as he tried to remember the Morse code patterns for common letters. The first message came out as incomprehensible gibberish, but the second attempt managed to convey the essential information. Copper Ridge, under attack by Barlow gang. Need immediate assistance. Many dead. Whether anyone would receive the message in time to matter remained to be seen. But Marcus had done what he could. Now he faced the problem of getting back to the courthouse alive while the battle raged around him. The return journey proved even more dangerous than his initial sprint to the telegraph office. The church fire had grown into a raging inferno that lit up the entire town center, eliminating any concealment for defensive movements. Worse, 2 of Barlow's men had advanced to positions that commanded the route between the telegraph office and the courthouse. Marcus waited until a particularly intense exchange of gunfire drew the sniper's attention, then made his desperate dash across the killing ground. This time his luck ran out halfway to safety. The bullet struck his left leg just below the knee, spinning him around and sending him sprawling in the dusty street. Pain shot through his body like liquid fire, but he forced himself to keep moving. Lying still in the open would mean certain death. He crawled the remaining distance to the courthouse using his arms and one good leg, leaving a trail of blood that glistened in the firelight. Tom Bradley saw him coming and provided covering fire that kept the snipers from finishing their wounded target strong. Hands dragged Marcus through the courthouse door as bullets chipped stone from the wall around them. He found himself lying on the floor next to Sheriff Watson, both men wounded and bleeding, but still alive in a town that was rapidly dying around them. "Did you get the message sent?" Watson asked weakly. Marcus nodded, too exhausted and pain-racked to speak. He had accomplished his mission, but whether it would make any difference in the outcome remained to be seen. The battle for Copper Ridge continued through the night, as buildings burned and good men died defending their homes. By dawn, the outcome would be decided one way or another, but the cost in blood and suffering would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Dutch Barlow smiled as he watched the town burn. Everything was proceeding exactly according to his plan, and soon Copper Ridge would serve as a warning to anyone who thought they could stand against his growing army of outlaws and killers. What he didn't know was that 5 miles away, Eleanor Cassidy was saddling her horse and checking her weapons one final time. The sound of battle had convinced her that waiting was no longer an option. The woman Marcus Whitfield had mocked was about to ride toward the sound of gunfire, and her arrival would change everything. Eleanor Cassidy urged her mare through the pre-dawn darkness with the skill of someone born to the saddle. The big bay horse, trained by Jack during their years together, moved silently across the rocky terrain despite the urgent pace. Both rider and mount understood that stealth was essential. Charging blindly into a battlefield would serve no purpose except adding another corpse to the growing pile. The sounds of battle had changed during the past hour, shifting from intense gunfire to sporadic shots punctuated by screaming and the crackle of flames. Eleanor's experienced ear told her that the organized defense of Copper Ridge was collapsing, leaving only pockets of desperate resistance scattered throughout the burning town. She pulled her horse to a stop on Cemetery Hill, a rise that overlooked the town from the southeast. What she saw in the firelight below made her jaw clench with cold fury. At least 6 buildings were burning, including the church where she had married Jack 17 years earlier. Bodies lay sprawled in the streets like discarded dolls, some moving weakly, while others had found the stillness that only death could bring. The courthouse still showed signs of active defense, with muzzle flashes visible from several windows. But the building was surrounded by at least 4 attackers who were systematically destroying anyone foolish enough to show themselves. Eleanor counted 7 different positions where outlaws had taken cover, indicating that Dutch Barlow had committed his entire force to this final assault. Her tactical assessment was swift and professional. The defenders were trapped and outnumbered with limited ammunition and multiple wounded. Without immediate intervention, the courthouse would fall within the hour, leaving no survivors to tell the story of Copper Ridge's destruction. Eleanor had 2 choices: retreat to safety and preserve her own life, or enter a battle where the odds of survival were minimal at best. The smart decision was obvious, but Eleanor Cassidy had never been interested in playing it safe when innocent people needed help. She dismounted and tied her horse to a sturdy oak tree, positioning the animal where it could graze peacefully while remaining hidden from observers in the town below. If she died in the coming fight, at least the mare would survive to find her way home. Her weapons check was methodical and thorough. The Winchester held 15 rounds of 44-40 ammunition, with an additional 50 cartridges distributed in her belt pouches. The shotgun was loaded with double-aught buckshot that could devastate human targets at close range. Her Colt revolver carried 6 rounds in the cylinder, with speed loader strips prepared for rapid reloading. More important than weapons was her detailed knowledge of Copper Ridge's layout. Eleanor had visited the town regularly for 15 years, shopping at Henderson's store, attending church services, and conducting business with various merchants. She knew every alley, every building, every potential route of approach or escape. The plan that formed in her mind was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than attempting a frontal assault that would surely fail, she would work her way through the town's eastern edge, using burning buildings as concealment while targeting the outlaws who had surrounded the courthouse. With luck and skill, she might be able to even the odds enough for the survivors to mount an effective counterattack. Eleanor began her descent from Cemetery Hill with the patient care of someone who understood that one careless footstep could mean death. The rocky slope was treacherous in darkness, but she had climbed these hills countless times. During her solitary rides through the countryside, the first challenge was crossing Main Street without being observed by the outlaws who controlled the town center. Eleanor waited until a particularly intense exchange of gunfire drew their attention, then sprinted across the open ground to take shelter behind the burned-out shell of Morrison's feed store. From this position, she could see the courthouse clearly and identify the specific threats facing the surviving defenders. 2 outlaws had positioned themselves behind an overturned wagon 30 yards from the building's front entrance, their rifles commanding a clear field of fire. A third attacker occupied the bell tower of the demolished church, where he could observe the entire battlefield and direct the movements of his companions. The 4th threat was the most dangerous, a sniper who had climbed onto the roof of Henderson's general store, giving him an elevated position that covered all approaches to the courthouse. This man was clearly the most skilled marksman among the attackers, as evidenced by the precision of his shots and the way the other outlaws deferred to his signals. Eleanor chose her first target carefully. The sniper on Henderson's roof represented the greatest immediate danger to any rescue attempt, but he was also the most difficult to reach without exposing herself to return fire. Instead, she focused on the church tower, where Crazy Eddie Fontaine was reloading his rifle while scanning for new targets. The distance was just over 200 yards, a challenging shot in darkness, but well within Eleanor's capabilities. She had spent countless hours practicing at similar ranges, using targets that Jack had positioned throughout their property. Her Winchester was zeroed for exactly this distance, and she knew the weapon's characteristics better than most men knew their own names. Eleanor settled into a prone firing position, using the feed store's stone foundation to steady her rifle. The sight picture was clear, despite the poor light, with Crazy Eddie's silhouette perfectly framed against the flames rising from the church below him. She controlled her breathing, allowed for the slight crosswind, and squeezed the trigger with steady pressure. The bullet struck Crazy Eddie's center mass, spinning him around and sending him tumbling from the bell tower to crash onto the church steps 40 feet below. His rifle clattered across the stone, temporarily silencing one of the most dangerous positions on the battlefield. The shot's echo had barely faded when Eleanor was already moving to a new position. She had learned from Jack that successful sniping required constant movement. Fire once, relocate immediately, never give the enemy time to triangulate your position and return effective fire. Her second position was behind the blacksmith shop, where Pike Morrison and another outlaw were preparing to assault the courthouse's rear entrance. They had gathered several bottles of kerosene and were fashioning crude firebombs that could burn out the remaining defenders within minutes. This situation required different tactics. At close range, Eleanor's shotgun would be far more effective than the rifle. She worked her way through the shadows until she was within 30 feet of the two men, close enough to hear their whispered conversation about the best way to set fire to the building. "Just throw 'em through the windows and let the flames do the work," Pike was saying. "Don't matter if we burn the whole place down. Ain't gonna be nobody left to complain about property damage." His companion, a thin man with nervous hands and darting eyes, seemed less certain about the plan. "What if some of them get out the back while we're lighting up the front? Then we shoot 'em as they run," Pike replied with casual cruelty. "Dutch wants this town to remember what happens when people try to fight back." Eleanor had heard enough. She stepped out of the shadows with her shotgun leveled, the twin barrels steady as granite, despite the chaos surrounding them. Neither outlaw had time to react before she pulled both triggers simultaneously. The double load of buckshot struck, both men at point-blank range, the devastating impact lifting them off their feet and hurling them backward in spreading clouds of blood and shredded clothing. Pike Morrison's criminal career ended in a crimson spray that painted the blacksmith shop's wall, while his companion died so quickly that the surprised expression never left his face. Eleanor immediately broke open the shotgun and reloaded with practiced efficiency, her hands moving automatically while her eyes scanned for additional threats. The courthouse was only 50 yards away now, but those 50 yards were swept by rifle fire from multiple positions. Inside the besieged building, Tom Bradley heard the distinctive boom of a shotgun and felt a surge of hope that he hadn't experienced since the battle began. Someone was fighting on their side, and whoever it was knew how to handle weapons under combat conditions. "Marcus, can you still shoot?" Tom called to the wounded rancher. Marcus struggled to a sitting position, his leg wound throbbing with every heartbeat, but his rifle still functional. "I can manage. What do you need me to do?" "Cover the front windows when I give the signal. Someone's out there helping us, and we need to coordinate our efforts before Dutch figures out what's happening." The opportunity came when Eleanor made her next move. She had circled around to approach the overturned wagon where two outlaws continued their siege of the courthouse's main entrance. Her plan was to create enough confusion for the defenders to break out of their trap. Eleanor's third shot came from an unexpected angle, the bullet striking one of the wagon defenders in the shoulder and spinning him around with a scream of pain and surprise. The wound wasn't fatal, but it announced that the outlaws were no longer the only hunters on the battlefield. Tom Bradley seized the moment, leading 4 surviving defenders in a coordinated breakout that caught the remaining attackers off guard. The courthouse's front door burst open as armed townsmen poured into the street, their weapons blazing as they sought to break the siege that had trapped them for hours. The battle's momentum shifted dramatically as Eleanor and the courthouse Defenders caught Dutch Barlow's gang in a crossfire that turned their carefully planned positions into death traps. The outlaws found themselves fighting enemies from multiple directions, their numerical advantage neutralized by Eleanor's tactical intervention. Dutch Barlow watched his carefully orchestrated assault dissolve into chaos and understood that someone with military experience had entered the fight. His elevated position behind the grain elevator gave him a clear view of the battlefield, and he quickly identified the courthouse breakout as a coordinated maneuver rather than desperate panic. "Jackson, Murphy, fall back to the saloon and set up defensive positions," Dutch shouted to his surviving men. "We got ourselves a real fighter out there, and we need to regroup before they pick us off one by one." The retreat was skillfully executed, with covering fire that allowed 3 outlaws to reach the Golden Nugget Saloon without casualties. Dutch himself remained in his sniper position, his rifle seeking the mysterious defender who had turned victory into potential defeat. Eleanor saw the tactical withdrawal and understood that the battle was entering a new phase. The outlaws were no longer attacking but defending, which meant the initiative had shifted to her side. However, Dutch Barlow was still alive and extremely dangerous, his elevated position commanding most of the town center. She made her way carefully toward the courthouse, using burning buildings as concealment, while avoiding the open areas that Dutch's rifle could cover. The survivors inside the building needed medical attention and ammunition, but reaching them safely required eliminating the sniper who controlled the high ground. Tom Bradley saw Eleanor approaching and felt his breath catch in his throat. Even in the poor light and amid the chaos of battle, he recognized the woman who had been mocked in the Golden Nugget Saloon just 1 week earlier. The fat woman that Marcus had ridiculed was now risking her life to save the town that had treated her with casual cruelty. "Marcus, you need to see this," Tom said quietly. Marcus dragged himself to the window and looked out at the approaching figure. Recognition hit him like a physical blow, followed immediately by shame so intense it almost overwhelmed the pain from his wounded leg. Eleanor Cassidy was walking through hell to reach them, her weapons ready and her courage unquestioned. "She came back," Marcus whispered. "After what I said to her, after how I treated her, she came back to help us." Eleanor reached the courthouse steps just as Dutch Barlow's rifle cracked from the grain elevator. The bullet missed her by inches, chipping stone from the building's facade and reminding everyone that the battle was far from over. She dove through the courthouse door as Tom Bradley and 2 other men provided covering fire. Inside, she found a scene that would have broken the heart of anyone with less experience in frontier hardships. Sheriff Watson lay unconscious in a pool of his own blood, his breathing shallow and irregular. 3 townsmen sat propped against the wall, their wounds roughly bandaged but still seeping. Marcus Whitfield crouched by a broken window, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes alert and focused. "How many of them are left?" Eleanor asked without preamble. 4, maybe 5, Tom replied. "Dutch Barlow is in the grain elevator with a clear shot at everything that moves. 3 others are holed up in the saloon, probably setting up an ambush." Eleanor studied the tactical situation with professional assessment. The outlaws were trapped but still dangerous, their defensive positions strong enough to hold off conventional assault for hours. However, she knew things about Copper Ridge's layout that Dutch Barlow had never learned. "There's a tunnel that runs from the bank to the saloon's basement," she told Tom, "built during the Indian troubles 10 years ago. If we can reach it without being seen, we can get behind them." The plan was desperate and dangerous, but it offered their best chance of ending the siege before more defenders died from their wounds. Eleanor was volunteering to crawl through a pitch-black tunnel to emerge in the middle of an enemy stronghold, armed only with her weapons and the element of surprise. Marcus struggled to his feet, ignoring the agony in his wounded leg. "I'm going with you," Eleanor looked at him with steady eyes that revealed nothing of her thoughts about his past behavior. "You can barely walk. You'd slow me down and get us both killed." "Maybe," Marcus admitted. "But I owe you this much. After what I said, after how I acted, I need to make it right." Tom Bradley watched this exchange with a growing understanding of the deeper currents that ran beneath the surface of their desperate situation. This wasn't just about tactics and survival. It was about redemption, courage, and the kind of character that emerged when comfortable illusions were stripped away by mortal danger. The decision was made when Dutch Barlow's rifle spoke again, the bullet punching through the courthouse wall close enough to shower them with splinters. Time was running out for everyone trapped in the building. Eleanor checked her weapons one final time and prepared to enter the tunnel that would either lead to victory or become her tomb. The woman who had endured mockery with quiet dignity was about to demonstrate the kind of courage that legends were built upon. The tunnel entrance lay hidden beneath a heavy iron grate in the bank's basement, concealed behind a false wall that looked like solid stone. Eleanor had discovered it years earlier when Jack was helping the bank president Samuel Hendricks reinforce his building against potential Indian attacks. The secret had died with both men, leaving Eleanor as the only person in Copper Ridge who knew about the underground passage. Marcus followed Eleanor through the bank's shattered rear entrance, his wounded leg sending spikes of agony through his body with every step. The building's interior was a scene of devastating destruction, furniture smashed, papers scattered like fallen leaves, and dark stains on the floor that told the story of Pike Morrison and Crazy Eddie's brutal efficiency. "The entrance is behind that bookshelf," Eleanor whispered, pointing toward a tall oak cabinet that had somehow survived the explosion. "Help me move it, but keep quiet. Sound carries in these buildings." Together, they shifted the heavy furniture, revealing the iron grate that covered the tunnel's mouth. The passage beyond disappeared into absolute blackness, its depths unknowable and threatening. Marcus felt a surge of claustrophobia as he stared into the void, but Eleanor was already working to lift the heavy metal cover. "This tunnel runs beneath Main Street directly to the saloon's basement," she explained as they prepared to descend. "Built in sections during the winter of '78, when Chief Running Bear's warriors were raiding settlements throughout the territory. Supposed to be an escape route if the town was overrun. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A passage built to help people flee from danger was now being used to approach it deliberately." Marcus wondered if the men who had constructed this tunnel could have imagined it would one day serve such a purpose. Eleanor went first, lowering herself through the opening with practiced ease, despite the Winchester rifle slung across her back and the shotgun in her hands. The tunnel was just tall enough for an average person to move through without crawling, though Marcus's height would make the journey uncomfortable. The darkness was absolute and oppressive, pressing against them like a living thing with weight and substance. Eleanor moved forward by touch, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall while her feet felt carefully for obstacles or changes in the tunnel floor. Behind her, Marcus struggled to keep pace despite the throbbing agony in his wounded leg. The air in the tunnel was stale and thick, carrying the musty smell of earth and stone that hadn't seen sunlight in over a decade. Worse was the metallic taste of fear that seemed to coat Marcus's tongue as they moved deeper into the underground passage. Every step took them further from safety and closer to a confrontation that might end with their bodies rotting in the darkness. "How much further?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible in the confined space. "About halfway," Eleanor replied without turning around. "Try to stay quiet. These walls are old, but sound can still carry to the buildings above." They continued in silence, their progress marked only by the soft scraping of boots on stone and Marcus's increasingly labored breathing. His wounded leg was stiffening as shock wore off, making each step more difficult than the last. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the tunnel's coolness, and he began to wonder if he would collapse before they reached their destination. Eleanor sensed his distress without needing to see his face. She had helped Jack tend wounded animals often enough to recognize the signs of someone pushing beyond their physical limits. Marcus Whitfield was operating on pure determination now, his body ready to quit, but his mind refusing to surrender. "Rest for a minute," she said, stopping at a wider section of the tunnel where support beams created a small alcove. "Catch your breath before we go further." Marcus slumped against the stone wall, grateful for the respite even though he knew it made him appear weak. The woman he had ridiculed was now showing him more consideration than he had ever shown anyone in his privileged life, a fact that added emotional pain to his physical suffering. "Why did you come back?" he asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could stop himself. "After what I said to you, after how I treated you, why risk your life for people who never showed you kindness?" Eleanor was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom about the nature of human behavior. "My Jack used to say that a person's character isn't measured by how they treat folks who can help them, but by how they treat folks who can't. Said it was easy to be nice to people with money and power. But the real test came when you dealt with someone who had nothing to offer in return." She paused, and Marcus could almost feel her studying him in the darkness. "You treated me badly because you could, because there was no cost to you and no consequences. But that says more about your character than mine." The words hit Marcus harder than any bullet could have. He had spent his adult life believing that his success and wealth made him a superior person, worthy of respect and deference from those less fortunate. Eleanor's simple observation shattered that comfortable delusion, forcing him to confront the ugly truth about his own behavior. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "Everything about how I acted was wrong." "Maybe," Eleanor replied. "But wrong can be fixed if a person's willing to do the work. Question is whether you learned anything from this, or if you'll go back to being the same man you were before." They resumed their journey through the tunnel, but Marcus found himself thinking about Eleanor's words, more than the pain in his leg or the danger waiting ahead. He had never been forced to examine his own character so honestly, and the process was more uncomfortable than any physical wound. The tunnel began to slope upward as they approached the saloon end of the passage. Eleanor moved even more carefully now, knowing that they were directly beneath the Golden Nugget's foundation. Above them, Dutch Barlow's surviving men were preparing for the final phase of their assault on Copper Ridge, unaware that their enemies were approaching from below. "The exit is just ahead," Eleanor whispered. "Opens into a storage room behind the main bar. From there, we'll have access to the saloon's interior, but we'll also be walking into whatever trap they've prepared." Marcus checked his rifle, ensuring that a round was chambered and ready to fire. His hands moved with new confidence, despite the pain that continued to throb through his body. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he was determined to prove that Eleanor's faith in his potential for redemption wasn't misplaced. The tunnel exit was covered by another iron grate, this one much older and more corroded than the entrance they had used. Eleanor worked carefully to lift it, conscious that any sudden noise might alert the outlaws to their presence. The metal scraped softly against stone as she moved it aside, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the confined space. Beyond the grate lay a small storage room filled with barrels and boxes, dimly illuminated by light, filtering through cracks in the wooden door that led to the saloon's main area. Eleanor could hear voices from the next room, Dutch Barlow's surviving men, discussing their next move in the low, urgent tones of professionals planning violence. "Courthouse is finished, but we need to make sure there ain't no witnesses left to identify us," someone was saying. "Burn the whole building down and anyone still inside with it." Another voice, younger and more nervous, expressed doubts about the plan. "Dutch ain't gonna like us finishing this without him. He wanted to be here for the final killing. Dutch are busy keeping them pinned down, the first voice replied. Besides, dead is dead. Don't matter who pulls the trigger as long as the job gets done. Eleanor listened to this exchange with growing anger. These men weren't just criminals. They were sadists who took pleasure in causing suffering. The casual way they discussed murdering wounded people revealed a level of moral corruption that went beyond simple greed or desperation. She motioned for Marcus to stay back as she approached the storage room door. Through the gaps in the wooden planks, she could see into the saloon's main area, where 3 men had positioned themselves behind overturned tables and chairs. Their rifles were trained on the front and rear entrances, ready to cut down anyone foolish enough to attempt a direct assault. The tactical situation was clear, but challenging. Eleanor and Marcus had achieved surprise by approaching from an unexpected direction, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. Worse, any extended firefight would allow Dutch Barlow to abandon his sniper position and join the battle, turning their slim advantage into certain defeat. Eleanor made her decision with the cold calculation that Jack had taught her during their years together. Sometimes survival required ruthless efficiency rather than honorable combat. She positioned her shotgun for maximum effect and prepared to open the storage room door. When I go through that door, stay behind me and shoot anything that moves, she told Marcus. Don't hesitate, don't try to wound them, and don't give them a chance to surrender. These men don't deserve mercy, and showing it will get us both killed. Marcus nodded, understanding that they had moved beyond civilized rules into a realm where only the most violent would survive. His comfortable moral certainties had no place in this brutal reality. Eleanor burst through the storage room door like an avenging angel, her shotgun booming as she caught the 3 outlaws completely unprepared for attack from their rear. The first man died instantly, both barrels of buckshot taking him center mass and hurling him. Across a poker table in a spray of blood and shredded clothing, the second outlaw managed to turn and raise his rifle before Marcus's shot took him in the chest, the bullet's impact spinning him around and sending him crashing into the bar with bone-crushing force. He slid to the floor, leaving a crimson smear on the polished wood. His weapon clattering away into the shadows, the third man, faster and more experienced than his companions, rolled behind the bar and returned fire with his revolver. Bullets splintered the wooden doorframe around Eleanor as she dove for cover behind an overturned table, her empty shotgun useless until she could reload. Marcus limped forward despite his wounded leg, his rifle seeking a target among the bottles and mirrors behind the bar. He could see muzzle flashes as the hidden outlaw continued shooting, but the man's position provided excellent concealment from direct fire. "He's got us pinned down," Marcus called to Eleanor. "Can you get around behind him?" Eleanor was already moving, her knowledge of the saloon's layout allowing her to navigate the obstacle-filled room despite the poor light. She had broken open her shotgun and reloaded with fresh shells, the familiar weight of the weapon providing comfort in the chaos of combat. The outlaw behind the bar was so focused on Marcus that he never saw Eleanor approaching from his blind side. His first warning came when the twin barrels of her shotgun pressed against the back of his neck, cold steel that promised instant death if he made any sudden movements. "Drop your weapons and put your hands where I can see them," Eleanor commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The man froze, understanding that he was one trigger pull away from joining his dead companions. His revolver clattered to the floor as he raised his hands in surrender, though his eyes continued to search for some avenue of escape or counterattack. "Please don't kill me," he begged, his earlier bravado replaced by desperate fear. "I got money hidden away, gold coins and paper money. You can have all of it if you let me go." Eleanor studied his face with the cold assessment of someone who had learned to judge character under extreme circumstances. What she saw there, the calculating look of a man planning treachery even as he begged for mercy, told her everything she needed to know about his true intentions. "Where's Dutch Barlow planning to attack next?" she asked. "I don't know nothing about Dutch's plans," the outlaw lied. "We just follow orders. We don't ask questions." The denial came too quickly and with too much nervous energy. Eleanor could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what Dutch Barlow intended to do, but hoped to use that information as a bargaining chip for his own survival. Marcus limped over to join them, his rifle trained on the captured outlaw despite his exhaustion and pain. "What do we do with him?" Before Eleanor could answer, the distinctive crack of Dutch Barlow's rifle echoed from the direction of the grain elevator. The sniper was still active and dangerous, his elevated position allowing him to dominate the battlefield, even with most of his gang eliminated. "Dutch is going to realize something's wrong when his boys don't report back," Eleanor said grimly. "We need to end this before he decides to burn down the courthouse with everyone still inside." The captured outlaw saw an opportunity in their distraction and made his fatal mistake. His hand darted toward a hidden derringer in his boot, the small weapon appearing with practiced speed as he prepared to shoot Eleanor at point-blank range. Marcus saw the movement and reacted without conscious thought, his rifle barking as he put a bullet through the would-be killer's heart. The outlaw collapsed backward, his derringer firing harmlessly into the ceiling as death claimed him before his betrayal could succeed. Eleanor looked at Marcus with new respect. The pampered rancher who had mocked her in this very saloon was gone, replaced by a man who could make life-or-death decisions in split seconds. Combat had burned away his arrogance and revealed the courage that had always existed beneath his privileged exterior. "Good shooting," she said simply, but Marcus heard the approval in her voice and felt something inside his chest that he hadn't experienced since childhood. The warm glow of earned respect from someone whose opinion truly mattered. Outside, the battle for Copper Ridge was entering its final phase. Dutch Barlow remained in his sniper position, but he was now alone against an unknown number of enemies who had proven themselves capable of defeating his carefully trained gang. The initiative had shifted decisively, and for the first time since the assault began, Dutch Barlow was fighting for his own survival rather than terrorizing helpless victims. Eleanor reloaded her weapons and prepared for the final confrontation. One more dangerous man stood between Copper Ridge and safety, but he was the deadliest opponent they had yet faced, a professional. Killer with military training and nothing left to lose, the woman who had endured mockery with quiet dignity was about to face her greatest test, with the life of every person in town hanging in the balance. Dutch Barlow knew something had gone catastrophically wrong the moment he heard gunfire from inside the Golden Nugget. His carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling with deadly efficiency, and for the first time in his criminal career, he found himself genuinely surprised by an enemy's capabilities. From his elevated position atop the grain elevator, Dutch had watched the courthouse defenders break their siege and eliminate several of his men. Now the sounds from the saloon told him that his remaining gang members were either dead or fighting for their lives against an opponent who had outmaneuvered them completely. The realization that he might actually lose this battle sent cold fury through Dutch's battle-hardened mind. He had built his reputation on the systematic destruction of frontier towns, leaving behind a trail of burned buildings and broken communities that stretched across 3 territories. Copper Ridge was supposed to be his masterpiece, a demonstration of power so complete that entire regions would surrender rather than face his wrath. Instead, he was about to become the survivor of his own gang, forced to flee like a common criminal, while his carefully constructed legend crumbled into dust and ashes. Dutch's professional assessment of the tactical situation was swift and brutal. His elevated position gave him excellent fields of fire, but it also trapped him with limited escape routes. The ladder leading down from the grain elevator could be covered by enemy fire, and the building itself would become a death trap if his opponents decided to set it ablaze. More troubling was his complete ignorance about who was fighting against him. Dutch had studied Copper Ridge for weeks, identifying every potential threat and neutralizing the most dangerous defenders during the initial assault. Sheriff Watson was wounded and ineffective. The town's other fighting men were either dead or pinned down in the courthouse, and there should have been no one left with the skill and courage to mount an effective counterattack. Yet someone had not only rallied the survivors, but had systematically hunted down his gang with the precision of a trained killer. Dutch found himself facing an enemy whose capabilities he couldn't assess and whose next move he couldn't predict, a situation that violated every principle of successful criminal operations. Inside the Golden Nugget, Eleanor methodically searched the dead outlaws for ammunition and useful equipment. Combat had taught her that surviving one engagement meant preparing immediately for the next, and Dutch Barlow represented a far more dangerous opponent than the men they had just eliminated. She found a box of rifle cartridges in one outlaw's saddlebags and a fully loaded Colt revolver in another's holster. More importantly, she discovered a hand-drawn map of Copper Ridge with defensive positions marked in red ink, proving that the attack had been planned with military precision. They knew exactly where to hit us, Eleanor observed, showing the map to Marcus. Dutch Barlow has been studying this town for weeks, learning our weaknesses and planning how to exploit them. Marcus examined the detailed drawings with growing understanding of how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. Every important building was marked, every defensive position identified, every potential escape route blocked. The Barlow gang had approached Copper Ridge like a military objective rather than a simple robbery target. "How do we fight someone who knows our every move before we make it?" Marcus asked. Eleanor smiled grimly as she checked the loads in her weapons. "We use the one advantage he can't plan for, local knowledge that isn't on any map. Jack used to say that the best battle plans fall apart when they meet unexpected terrain." She led Marcus to the saloon's rear window, which provided a clear view of the grain elevator where Dutch had positioned himself. The building was old but solidly constructed, its wooden framework and metal siding capable of stopping most rifle bullets. More importantly, its height gave Dutch command of the entire town center. "He's trapped up there as much as we're trapped down here," Eleanor explained. "Question is, who makes the first mistake? That gives the other side an advantage." The standoff stretched through the remaining hours of darkness as both sides waited for the other to reveal a weakness that could be exploited. Dutch maintained his overwatch position, his rifle ready to cut down anyone foolish enough to expose themselves. Eleanor and Marcus remained in the saloon, using its solid construction for protection while planning their next move. The first hint of dawn brought subtle changes to the tactical situation. The fires that had illuminated the battlefield throughout the night were beginning to die down, reducing visibility while creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that could conceal movement. More importantly, the approaching sunrise would eliminate Dutch's ability to use muzzle flashes to locate his enemies. Eleanor recognized the opportunity and began preparing for what she knew would be the final phase of the battle. She had identified Dutch Barlow's greatest weakness, his isolation in a position that offered excellent fields of fire but limited mobility. If she could force him to move, she might be able to catch him exposed and vulnerable. "I'm going to circle around to the north side of the grain elevator," Eleanor told Marcus. "When Dutch sees me moving, he'll shift position to get a clear shot. That's when you need to put rifle fire on his position from here. Force him to keep his head down while I get closer." Marcus understood the plan's dangerous simplicity. Eleanor was volunteering to act as bait, drawing Dutch's attention while exposing herself to deadly accurate fire from an elevated position. If Marcus failed to provide effective covering fire, she would die in the open ground between the saloon and the grain elevator. "Let me go instead," Marcus offered. "You're a better shot than I am. Makes more sense for you to provide cover while I draw his fire." Eleanor studied his face in the pre-dawn gloom, seeing genuine courage where arrogance and selfishness had once resided. The transformation was remarkable. The man who had mocked her for her appearance was now willing to sacrifice his life to protect hers. "Your leg won't carry you fast enough," she said gently. "Besides, I know every inch of ground between here and there. Been walking these streets for 15 years. The practical explanation masked deeper tactical reasoning. Eleanor understood that Dutch Barlow expected conventional male opponents who would approach his position directly and predictably. A woman moving with the fluid grace of someone intimately familiar with the terrain might confuse his assumptions long enough to create the opening she needed. Eleanor gathered her weapons and prepared for what might be her final journey. The Winchester rode across her back, fully loaded and ready for long-range work. The shotgun remained in her hands, its devastating close-range power perfect for the kind of encounter she expected at the grain elevator's base. "Give me 5 minutes to get into position," she instructed Marcus. "When you see me move toward the building, start shooting at anything that looks like a target. Don't try to be fancy, just keep his head down and his attention focused on you." Marcus nodded, positioning himself at the saloon's front window, where he could see both Eleanor's route and Dutch's likely firing positions. His wounded leg throbbed with every heartbeat, but his hands were steady and his vision clear. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he was determined to prove worthy of Eleanor's trust. Eleanor slipped out the saloon's rear door into the grey half-light that preceded true dawn. The town around her was a landscape of destruction, burned buildings, scattered bodies, and the acrid smell of gunpowder that hung in the still air like a tangible reminder of the night's violence. She moved with the silent efficiency Jack had taught her during their hunting expeditions, each step placed carefully to avoid loose stones or debris that might betray her position. The route she had chosen took her through the ruins of Morrison's feed store, behind the collapsed remains of the church, and along the creek bed that ran parallel to Main Street. Dutch Barlow maintained his vigil from the grain elevator's top platform, his experienced eyes scanning the lightening landscape for signs of movement. He had spent the dark hours considering his options, and had concluded that his best chance of survival lay in eliminating the remaining defenders before reinforcements could arrive from neighboring towns. The mysterious opponent who had destroyed his gang remained invisible, but Dutch knew that patience and superior position would eventually force them to make a mistake. When that moment came, his rifle would be ready to deliver swift and final justice. Eleanor reached the grain elevator's base just as the eastern sky began to show the first pale traces of approaching sunrise. The building's wooden framework creaked softly in the morning breeze, and she could hear Dutch moving around on the platform 40 feet above her head. She positioned herself beside the ladder that provided the only access to Dutch's position, her shotgun aimed upward at the spot where anyone descending would necessarily appear. If Dutch tried to escape by climbing down, she would have a perfect shot at point-blank range. The trap was set, but it required Dutch to make the first move. Eleanor settled into a position where she could wait comfortably while maintaining her aim on the critical killing zone. Jack's training had taught her that patience was often the most deadly weapon in any hunter's arsenal. Marcus saw Eleanor reach the grain elevator and began his part of the coordinated assault. His first shot was deliberately aimed high, the bullet striking the building's metal siding with a sharp clang that announced his position to Dutch Barlow. The second and third shots followed quickly, their impacts creating a steady drumbeat of sound that would mask any noise Eleanor made while positioning herself for the final confrontation. Dutch reacted exactly as Eleanor had predicted, shifting his position to return fire at the saloon where Marcus was shooting from cover. The movement exposed him briefly to Eleanor's line of sight, but the angle was poor and the range too great for effective shotgun work. What Dutch didn't realize was that Eleanor wasn't trying to shoot him from below. She was forcing him to make the tactical decision that would determine the battle's outcome. He could remain on the platform and continue trading shots with Marcus, or he could abandon his elevated position and try to escape. While the defenders were distracted, the Decision was made for him when Tom Bradley and 3 surviving courthouse defenders appeared at the grain elevator's opposite side. They had used the distraction of the firefight to move from their defensive positions, and now Dutch found himself surrounded by enemies with no clear escape. Dutch Barlow faced the moment that every professional criminal eventually encounters, the realization that his luck had finally run out and his skills were no longer sufficient to overcome the odds arrayed against him. He could die fighting from his elevated position, or he could attempt to break through the circle of enemies that had formed around his refuge. The choice he made revealed the character that had driven him to a life of violence and terror. Instead of surrendering or attempting to negotiate, Dutch decided to take as many enemies with him as possible. He began shooting with the systematic precision of someone who had accepted death but refused to face it passively. His first shot took one of Tom Bradley's men in the shoulder, spinning the cowboy around and sending him sprawling behind a water trough. The second bullet shattered a window in the saloon where Marcus was positioned, forcing the wounded rancher to dive for cover as glass exploded around him. Eleanor heard the accelerating gunfire and understood that the final phase of the battle had begun. Dutch was trapped and desperate, which made him more dangerous than ever. She began climbing the grain elevator's ladder with careful speed, her shotgun slung across her back to leave both hands free for the ascent. The ladder rungs were slick with morning dew and worn smooth by years of use, making the climb treacherous under ideal conditions. With gunfire erupting around her and the knowledge that Dutch might appear at any moment, Eleanor's ascent became an exercise in controlled terror. She climbed steadily upward, counting rungs to judge her progress, while listening to the gunfight that raged below and above her. Dutch's position allowed him to fire in multiple directions, keeping all the ground-based attackers pinned down while he searched for opportunities to eliminate them one by one. Eleanor reached the platform level just as Dutch's rifle clicked empty. She heard him cursing as he fumbled for fresh ammunition, the sound of his voice telling her that he was positioned near the platform's eastern edge, where he could cover the courthouse approach. This was the moment she had climbed 40 feet to reach, Dutch Barlow distracted and vulnerable, his deadly rifle temporarily useless while he reloaded. Eleanor pulled herself onto the platform with fluid motion, her shotgun coming off her shoulder as her boots found solid footing. Dutch turned at the sound of her arrival, his eyes widening with shock as he saw the woman who had destroyed his gang and shattered his carefully planned assault. For a frozen instant, both combatants stared at each other across 20 feet of wooden platform, each recognizing that only one would descend alive. "You're the one who's been killing my boys," Dutch said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and hatred. "Should have known it would take a woman to fight dirty enough to beat me." Eleanor kept her shotgun trained on his chest while she studied the man who had brought such terror to Copper Ridge. Dutch Barlow was smaller than she had expected, with graying hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent in harsh country. He looked more like a tired rancher than a legendary killer, but his hands moved toward his weapons with practiced speed, despite his apparent calm. "Your boys died because they chose to follow a man who murders innocent people for entertainment," Eleanor replied steadily. "Nothing dirty about stopping killers from killing." Dutch's laugh was bitter and empty. "Innocent people? Lady, there ain't no such thing in this world. Every man I ever killed had it coming for one reason or another, and every town I burned was full of folks who thought their money made them better than people like me." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus's voice calling from below. "Eleanor, are you all right up there?" The moment of distraction was exactly what Dutch had been waiting for. His hand darted toward the revolver on his hip with the lightning speed that had kept him alive through years of violent confrontations. The weapon cleared leather and began to rise toward Eleanor's position with deadly precision. But Eleanor Cassidy had been married to one of the finest gunfighters in the territory, and 17 years of watching Jack practice had taught her to read the subtle signs that preceded violent action. She saw Dutch's shoulder tense, noticed the slight shift in his weight, and recognized the predatory focus that entered his eyes. Her shotgun boomed once, both barrels discharging simultaneously at the range, where buckshot patterns created devastating wounds. Dutch Barlow was lifted off his feet and hurled backward against the platform's railing, his partially drawn revolver spinning away into the morning air. He tried to speak, perhaps to curse or threaten, or simply to deny the reality of his defeat. But death claimed him before the words could form. The man who had terrorized 3 territories with his systematic cruelty died alone on a wooden platform, his reputation destroyed by a woman whose only crime had been existing in a world that judged people by their appearance rather than their character. Eleanor stood over Dutch Barlow's body for several long moments, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this confrontation. The battle was over, but the scars it had left on Copper Ridge and its survivors would take much longer to heal. She called down to the men waiting below, her voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "It's finished. Dutch Barlow is dead." The response was a mixture of cheers, sobs, and prayers as the surviving residents of Copper Ridge realized that their ordeal had finally ended. The sun rose fully above the eastern mountains, painting the devastated town in golden light that seemed to promise hope despite the destruction that surrounded them. Eleanor climbed down from the grain elevator to find Marcus waiting for her at the bottom, his face showing exhaustion, pain, and something else, a respect and gratitude that went deeper than mere politeness. The man who had mocked her in the Golden Nugget Saloon was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true strength had nothing to do with wealth or social position. "I owe you my life," Marcus said simply. "All of us do. I know that doesn't erase what I said or how I acted, but I want you to know that I'm not the same man who treated you so poorly." Eleanor studied his face and saw genuine transformation in his eyes. Combat had burned away his arrogance and revealed the decent person who had always existed beneath the surface. The process had been brutal, but the result was someone she could respect and perhaps even forgive. "People can change if they're willing to do the hard work," she replied. "Question is whether you'll remember these lessons when life gets comfortable again." The cleanup began immediately as survivors emerged from hiding places throughout the town. Bodies needed to be buried, buildings required rebuilding, and the wounded demanded medical attention that stretched the community's limited resources. The work would take months, but Copper Ridge had survived its greatest test. Sheriff Watson recovered from his wounds to serve 6 more years before retiring to a small ranch outside town. Tom Bradley was elected as his replacement and proved to be an effective lawman who never forgot the lessons learned during the night when hell came to Copper Ridge. Marcus Whitfield kept his promise to become a better man. He used his wealth to help rebuild the town, established a school for children whose parents had died in the attack, and never again judged anyone by their appearance or social status. He never married, perhaps because he had learned that the only woman whose respect truly mattered would never be able to see him as anything more than a reminder of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and redemption. Eleanor returned to her farm and continued the quiet life she had always preferred. The story of her heroism spread throughout the territory, but she refused interviews and declined offers to capitalize on her fame. She had done what needed doing, nothing more and nothing less. On summer evenings, she would sit on her porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains where Jack was buried. The loneliness was bearable now, softened by the knowledge that she had honored his memory by using the skills he had taught her to protect innocent people from those who would do them harm. The Golden Nugget Saloon was rebuilt exactly as it had been before, but the atmosphere was never quite the same. Men still gathered there to drink and socialize, but the casual cruelty that had once passed for entertainment was gone. Everyone remembered the woman who had sat alone in the corner booth, and everyone understood that courage came in forms they had never expected. Marcus never again entered the Golden Nugget without thinking of Eleanor Cassidy and the Friday night when his mockery had revealed the emptiness of his character. The memory served as a constant reminder that a person's true worth had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with how they treated those who couldn't defend themselves. Years later, when traveling storytellers would recount the tale of Copper Ridge's darkest night, they would always end with the same moral. In a world where strength was often measured by wealth and influence, the greatest courage had come from a woman who asked for nothing except the right to live with dignity. She had ridden toward the sound of gunfire when all others fled, and in doing so, had saved not just a town, but the souls of the people who lived there. The fat woman in the saloon had become legend. But more importantly, she had proven that heroism existed in the most unexpected places, waiting for the moment when good people needed someone to stand between them and the darkness that threatened to consume everything they held dear. In the end, that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.